Hi, everybody. So, we're continuing through Chapter 4. Chapter 4 gives us methods and tools for analyzing arguments that help us to do these four different things: understand reasoning, evaluate reasoning, improve reasoning, and identify the sources of disagreement about reasoning. In the first video, we really focused on this first part: understanding reasoning and communicating that understanding. We were introduced to this idea that the purpose of an argument is to find the best answer to some question. And that gives us a way of thinking about what the different parts of an argument are doing. So when someone presents support for a conclusion, what they are doing is saying this support recommends this claim conclusion as the right answer to give the argument's implicit question as opposed to the conclusion's natural rivals. And so, by identifying the support, the conclusion, the implicit question, and the rivals, we show that we understand the argument. In this second video, we're going to look at these last two components of an argument's internal structure: the ranking of rivals and the relevance of support. And those tools are going to help us when it comes to evaluating reasoning, determining whether an argument is good or bad, strong or weak, and why. And then we'll also talk about improving reasoning and dealing with disagreement. As we begin to look at evaluating reasoning, it will help to think about the process of developing arguments. Now, our textbook doesn't focus on this until about page 183, but I'm going to start to talk about this idea here. And I'll try to do this with a couple visuals that I hope will also be helpful. So here's a way to think about how an argument is developed. Remember that the purpose of an argument is to find the best answer to some question, what we're calling the implicit question. Now, anytime we ask a question about the world, there are going to be a number of possible answers. Now, we have a question, we have a lot of possible answers, we want to figure out which one of these is the best answer, and the way we do that is by gathering information. As we gather more information, some of these possible answers will start to look less reasonable than others. Some of the possible answers we remove from the list. They don't seem like serious possibilities anymore. Maybe one of the answers, R3, starts to look less likely. It's still a possible answer to the question, but just less likely than R1. And if all goes well through this process, one of the possible answers will rise to the top as the best answer. Then, when we just move around the labeling a little, you can see how the process that we've just gone through basically leaves us with an argument. All of the information that we were gathering functions as support, showing that this particular possible answer is the best answer to the implicit question. And we have all the different ingredients here for an argument: the implicit question, the support, the conclusion, and the rival. Now, this is all kind of abstract, so we can see how this works in a particular case. So let's return to the example of Frank Corder, who crashed his plane into the White House lawn. And what I'm going to do here is go imaginatively through the process of putting together this argument. Maybe this isn't exactly how the investigators did it, but this will help us both to understand the argument better and set us up for evaluating it. So, how did the Secret Service officer's argument develop? Well, it all started with this particular event. Frank Corder crashed his plane into the White House lawn. Prior to that, there was no argument, there was no mystery, no questions. Nobody in the Secret Service was wondering about Frank Corder. But once that event happened, notice that prompted a question. Why did Corder crash his plane into the White House lawn? Suddenly, that question comes up. And with that question comes a range of possible answers. Maybe Corder wanted to assassinate the president. Maybe Corder was trying to land on the White House lawn as part of a dare. Maybe Corder wanted to kill himself dramatically. Of course, there are other possibilities. We'll just work with this small sample set to give us an idea of how this process works. And it's important that when I've listed these, I am listing these as if they were in a ranking. So put yourself in the place of the investigators right after Corder crashed his plane into the White House lawn. They don't have any other information. They want to know why he crashed his plane into the White House lawn, and chances are the assassination rival, that possible answer, is going to be near the top of the list. That's going to be at the front of the investigator's mind. And other possible answers are going to be farther down the list. Now, if the investigator's goal is to find the best answer to the question, well, they need to gather more information. So now the investigators start to look around and they learn that Frank Corder had a history of alcohol and drug problems. Now, that information is going to have an effect on how they think about the different possible answers. Just for purposes of illustration, we could say his history of alcohol and drug problems might lead the investigators to think that landing on the White House lawn as part of a dare is a little more likely as the answer to the implicit question. So it moves that answer up in the ranking of the rivals. The investigators start to take that answer more seriously. What happens when they gather still more information? The fact that the plane contained no explosives or weapons. Well, once they learn that the plane contained no explosives or weapons, that's probably going to push the assassination rival down in the ranking. They're going to take that rival less seriously. When they learn that Frank Corder had no grievances against President Clinton, that's going to push the assassination rivals still farther down the list of possible answers to the implicit question. And then when investigators learn that Frank Corder recently separated from his wife and lost his father, well, that's the kind of information that would lead someone to think that Corder wanted to kill himself dramatically. And in fact, if we go back to the original article, that's what the officials concluded at the end of their investigation. And now, if we take the rival answer that's at the top of the list, at the top of the ranking, we can label that the conclusion. And basically, what we've got here is the argument that the investigators presented. We have here the support, the conclusion, the implicit question, and the rivals. S1 through S5 recommend C as the right answer to give the argument's implicit question as opposed to the conclusion's natural rivals. And so we've got here on the screen the complete argument, the support and conclusion, the implicit questions and rivals, but we've also just finished this process of looking at how the argument developed. And having that picture of how an argument develops will help us to think about our next set of tools, the ranking of the rivals and the relevance of support. So let me go ahead and present this process again in just a slightly different format. So here on the right-hand side of the screen are the complete argument, the implicit questions, support, conclusions, and rivals. And now let me again display the process of reaching that argument. It begins with S1. Corder crashing his plane into the White House lawn. That's what prompts the question, the investigator's question, why did Corder crash his plane into the White House lawn? And in response to that question, there are going to be a range of possible answers. And then as the investigators add more information, as they gather more information, their view of the ranking of the rivals is going to change. And as they gather more information, it will change yet again. And as they add more information, it will change yet again until we have the complete argument and the final ranking of the rivals. Now, as you've probably noticed, I've already started using this language of ranking of rivals. So the idea here is on the screen when I list the rivals, I'm not just putting up a list, but a ranking. And the rival that is at the top is the rival that looks like the best answer to the implicit question based on the available support. So when the investigation first gets started, maybe R1 looks like the best answer to the question based on the available data. And then as more information is gathered, R2 looks like the best answer. But then when all the information is finally in, R3 or C3 turns out to be the best answer to this question. And this idea of ranking gives us a way of thinking about and visualizing the strength of an argument. So imagine that we were looking at a complete argument, and when all of the pieces of support are in, the ranking of the rivals looks something like this: R1, R2, and R3 at about the same level. Now, if someone were to come along and try to make the claim that the support favored one conclusion over the other, based on this visualization, we'd say, no, that's not a particularly strong argument. The support does not favor one answer over the others. On the other hand, if we'd gathered a bunch of support and our ranking looked like this, we'd want to say, well, the third rival is slightly favored over the others, but not really. That's a way of saying the argument is not very strong. Of course, what we would like to see when we put together an argument is that the support favors one rival decisively over the others. So a ranking more like this. And in this case, it's clear that one answer is far better than the others, and that's just to say that the argument strongly favors one conclusion as opposed to others. The last tool, then, that we want to bring to the table is the relevance of support. So if the goal of an argument is to figure out what is the best answer to a particular question, then when you're gathering support, you're going to want to include information that helps you to make that decision. And with this picture of the ranking of the rivals, that's going to be information that makes a difference to the ranking of the rivals. Notice, if a piece of support doesn't have an effect on how you think about the different answers to a question, then it probably doesn't belong in the argument. The reason that facts about Napoleon Bonaparte don't appear in this argument about Frank Corder's motivation is that information about Napoleon is not going to affect the ranking of the rivals one way or the other. Information about Frank Corder's drinking habits, his views about President Clinton, whether there were bombs on the plane, that sort of information is relevant. It does make a difference to how we view the different possible answers to the implicit question. Now, when you look at this section in the textbook, starting on page 175, the text identifies 4 general ways in which support can have an effect on the ranking of the rivals. We'll just illustrate a few of these with this example and then give you the complete list afterwards. So take a look at this first piece of support, S1. How does that information affect the ranking of the rivals? Well, this information basically sets up the initial list of rivals. It's not changing a pre-existing list of rivals. Prior to S1, prior to Frank Corder's crashing into the White House lawn, there was no investigation, no question, no possible answers. And this is one case of a more general pattern where a piece of support can change the list of rivals in some way by either adding rivals to the list or removing rivals from the list. If we look at S2, how does S2 affect the ranking of the rivals? Well, notice we can compare how the list of rivals look without S2 and how it looks with S2. And that gives us a way of talking about the difference that S2 makes. So S2 is relevant because it raises R2 above R1 in the ranking of the rivals. So this rival changes the order of the rivals in the ranking. Something similar happens with S3. S3 is relevant because it lowers R1 below R3 in the ranking of the rivals. Now, we're doing this very abstractly. If you go back to the earlier part of the video where we walked through the different steps of the argument, you'll see these things happening. When we learned that there were no explosives aboard Frank Corder's plane, that leads us to think that the assassination rival is less likely. That moves the assassination rival down in the rankings. How does S4 affect the ranking of the rivals? Well, if we compare the ranking without S4 and with S4, you'll notice that the order of the rivals does not change. But that doesn't mean that S4 makes no difference to the argument. It does make a difference. It pushes R1 even farther down the ranking of the rivals. Your text will talk about this idea of increasing the gap. And of course, that's metaphorical language. But the idea is even if assassination was already at the bottom of our list, when we learn that Frank Corder had no grievances against President Clinton, that's going to make us take that rival even less seriously. And then when it comes to S5, how does that affect the ranking of the rivals? It raises R3 above R2 in the ranking. And so we end with the final form of the argument. Several pieces of support that lead the investigators to conclude that Frank Corder wanted to kill himself dramatically. At this point, we can summarize the 4 ways in which pieces of support can influence the ranking of the serious rivals. A piece of support can change the ranking of the serious rivals, change the order of the different rivals. It can change the list of serious rivals by adding rivals to the list or removing rivals from the list if they're not compatible with the support any longer. And we saw that S1 represented a kind of limit case, where this piece of information sets up the whole list of rivals. A piece of support can change the gaps in the ranking of the serious rivals. So it doesn't necessarily change the order, but makes a particular rival seem even less likely than it already did. Or a piece of support can change the amount of detail allowed in a serious rival. And you can find illustrations of these in the text and in the exercises. Keep in mind that in some of our upcoming quizzes, you will be asked to articulate the relevance of a piece of support. That's language that's going to be used in some of the questions. And what that means is put into words the difference that this piece of support makes to the ranking of the rivals. You can look at the examples that we just looked at as illustrations. So to say that a particular piece of support moves R3 above R2 in the ranking of the rivals. That's a way of describing with words the difference that a piece of support makes to the ranking of the rivals. So expect that in some of the upcoming quizzes. And keep in mind that when I ask you to articulate the relevance of a piece of support, I am asking you to say what difference the support makes. I am not asking why. We'll deal more with the why questions starting in Chapter 5. All right, we're moving into the last couple sections of this chapter. We've been introduced to the 6 tools that go to make up the internal structure of an argument. And we've seen the roles that they play in both understanding arguments and then also evaluating arguments. And now just a few more points to make as we wrap up this chapter. The next section of Chapter 4, on page 179, Interim Summary, gives a brief synopsis of what we've learned so far in this chapter, and then introduces a couple other distinctions and points. So the first distinction that this section introduces is between 2 types of support, specific and general support. Now, this distinction is not hard and fast. You'll find borderline cases, but in general, specific support is going to include details about the particular event, action, or phenomenon that the implicit question is asking about. Whereas general support is information that's not about this specific topic, but that is useful for understanding or appreciating the significance of details about this topic. Common examples of general information are the kind of thing you could find in a textbook or in a reference book. And as we continue to analyze arguments, we'll see that general information plays an important role in arguments. Again, sometimes without our realizing it. If we look at the support from the Frank Corder argument, we'll notice that all of this is specific information. Corder crashed his plane, he had a history of alcohol and drug problems, the plane contained no explosives, he had no grievances against President Clinton, he had recently separated from his wife and lost his father. Now, these are all pieces of information that are specific to the topic of this argument. But that doesn't mean that general information or general support is playing no role in the argument. This is, again, one of those cases where we are actually relying on general information all the time. We just don't always pay attention to it. But to help us see this, we could point out some key pieces of general information that are important for understanding this argument. Alcohol use increases readiness to engage in reckless behavior. Most assassins use either explosives or weapons. Anger or frustration is the sort of thing that motivates violence, and significant losses or tragedies can precipitate suicide. Now, these pieces of information were not stated in the article, probably because they're considered so obvious that stating them is not necessary. But notice, just because stating them is not necessary does not mean that they are playing no role. They are playing a role. They are what enable us to appreciate the significance of the specific support. So when I see that the plane contained no explosives or weapons, that makes me think that Corder probably did not want to assassinate the president because I have this idea that most assassins use either explosives or weapons. Now, when you are schematizing arguments based on written passages, you don't need to try to fill in all of the general background information. Frankly, if we really wanted to spell that all out, we would have to write down hundreds of thousands of pieces of information that we take for granted in our reasoning. But there will be cases, especially if an article or argument is about something specialized or technical, in order to help people understand it, the author may highlight certain general pieces of information as relevant to the argument. And when an author does that, you'll want to make sure to include that information in your schematization. All right, the next section of this interim summary is entitled Investigation, Making Reasoning Better, and touches just briefly on this third theme in Chapter 4, improving reasoning, figuring out how to strengthen arguments. And the suggestion here is to encourage you to think of all arguments that you run into in terms of an investigation. Even if you're dealing with an argument that isn't tied to an investigation, think about it in those terms. Think about how each piece of support that gets added to the argument affects how the ranking of the rivals looks. And once we understand how this process goes, we can imagine details, new pieces of information that would make the argument still stronger. To help us exercise this skill, again, on some of the quizzes, you will be asked a question that goes something like this. What would be some new information that would be relevant to this investigation? Information that would change the ranking of the rivals. Here, you're being invited to use your imagination. So S1 through S5 already give us all of the support that was listed in that original passage. But now put yourself in the place of the investigator. What sorts of further information would have an additional effect on the ranking of the rivals? And so here you're encouraged to use your imagination. Here's some examples. S6, Corder's journal showed he was contemplating killing himself. Notice that kind of information would definitely have an effect on the ranking of the rivals, and we can describe that effect. It would move C3 still farther up in the ranking of the rivals. S7, Corder had previously attempted to land on the National Mall. So if Corder has a history of trying to land near famous national monuments, that might cause us to add a new rival to the list, or maybe that would just push R2 up in the ranking of the rivals. If witnesses at a nearby bar said Corder stormed out on that night shouting about not being a coward and not being afraid, that information would push R2 up in the ranking of the rivals. Now, S6, S7, and S8 are just pulled from my imagination, but what they show is that I have an understanding of how support affects the ranking of the rivals. And when you can come up with pieces of support and describe their effect, you're showing that same kind of understanding. The last section of this chapter focuses on dealing with disagreement. So, when you present an argument and the person receiving it doesn't agree, doesn't accept it, or if the situation is reversed, how do we deal with that? Of course, there are cases where it is appropriate to agree to disagree, but if we're trying to solve problems in a family or in a business, sometimes decisions need to be made. And so it's in the best interest of everybody to try to get on the same page. But how can we do that? The list of tools that we've looked at in this chapter actually provide us with several things to look at as possible sources of disagreement. We were introduced to the first one back when we looked at the implicit question. So recall this case, two groups in a business disagreeing about the best strategy, but if it turns out that they're responding to different questions, there may not be a disagreement here at all. So when there is a disagreement, one of the first things that it's good to do is to get everybody together and ask, are we trying to answer the same question? If we're not trying to answer the same question, that's probably part of why this disagreement is coming up. But then if we are trying to answer the same question and there's still disagreement, there are a number of other places that we can look to diagnose that disagreement. We can ask ourselves, do we have the same set of rivals in mind? We're trying to figure out which answer is the best answer, and are both sides considering the same group of rivals? If not, that's a point that needs to be corrected. Do we agree on what the support is? That's where listing out pieces of support can be very handy. If one group has more information than the other, that might explain why they're coming to a different conclusion. Do we agree on the relevance of the support? Do we agree about how the support affects the ranking of the rivals? If people have slightly different background understandings, they may look at the same piece of support and think about its influence differently. One side thinks that this favors the main conclusion, the other side thinks this detracts from the main conclusion. And so we want to think about our views about the relevance of the support and also look at our general understanding of the world. So if our different backgrounds mean that we're viewing the situation differently, that might explain why we're disagreeing. Or if one person is bringing very specialized technical knowledge to a situation, that might explain why they view an argument differently than a non-specialist. These are all useful strategies for dealing with disagreement and trying to move people toward resolution. And they rely on the different tools and skills that we've developed over the course of this chapter. Many of these techniques are going to be similar to things that you already do when dealing with disagreements surrounding arguments, but these tools help to make sure that we have a shared set of vocabulary for talking about and analyzing arguments. All right, we've covered a lot of ground in this chapter, been introduced to a number of tools and concepts. Make sure that you're doing the reading, working on the exercises, and if you have questions, make sure to contact me, the instructor. Good luck with your work.